Widow finds a love letter hidden in her late husband's suit. Its contents change her life. Lisa's life had become a delicate balance of routine and loss. Each morning, she awoke early, as if her body was still following a rhythm set long before her husband's passing. The quiet of the house wrapped around her like a familiar blanket, the kind that was warm yet stifling. She would make herself a cup of tea in the kitchen, the same way Robert used to, and stare out the window at the garden they had tended to together. Every corner of the house seemed to hold his memory, from the worn armchair by the fireplace to the bookshelves filled with novels they had read side by side. She felt his absence in the air, like a presence that was still lingering just out of sight, a shadow that would never quite leave her side. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Lisa had always been a practical woman, a woman of routine and reason. When Robert passed away 2 years ago, after a lengthy illness, she had told herself she would stay strong. "I have to move forward," she would often say to her friends and family, convincing them, and herself, that she was handling everything as best as she could. But deep down, she knew she was treading water, unable to move forward and too afraid to move backward. Grief, she had learned, wasn't something you could easily pack away. It wasn't something that could be solved with time or distraction. It was like a weight she carried within her, one that would always make itself known in the quiet moments when she was left alone with her thoughts. The house, once filled with laughter and the hum of conversation, had grown eerily silent. Lisa had tried to fill that silence at first, inviting friends over for dinner, volunteering at the local animal shelter, joining a book club. But nothing worked. The noise of the world only seemed to amplify her loneliness, making her long for the days when the simple act of Robert's presence had been enough. She missed his gentle smile, the way he would tease her about her love for classical music, or how he would always find a way to fix whatever was broken in their home, whether it was a leaky faucet or a broken door handle. Robert was always the one who held everything together, the one who kept her grounded. And now that he was gone, she felt unmoored. The first few months after his death had been a blur. The funeral arrangements, the visitors, the well-meaning but ultimately hollow condolences, these were things Lisa had to go through, out of obligation rather than genuine need. At night, when the house fell silent, she would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the grief would ever subside. She didn't expect it to go away, but sometimes she wished for a reprieve. Some days, the sorrow felt like a living thing, breathing beside her, constantly reminding her that something precious had been taken from her. Lisa had a daughter, Emily, who was always encouraging her to move forward. Emily, a woman in her early 30s with a young family of her own, had been worried about her mother's isolation. "Mom, you have to start living for you again," she would say, her voice full of concern. "Come on, let's take a trip together. Or you could start doing something new. Maybe a hobby or a class. I've heard yoga is great for grief." But Lisa would just smile softly and nod, knowing that her daughter meant well, but unable to accept her suggestions. She wasn't sure what Emily wanted her to do. Go back to work? Find a new purpose? The thought of making major changes felt overwhelming. The weight of Robert's death pressed heavily on Lisa's heart, yet she never spoke of it openly. Instead, she kept herself busy, filling the days with small tasks. She would visit the local grocery store, her eyes scanning the shelves for familiar brands, making the list in her head like she had done hundreds of times before. When she returned home, she would put away the groceries as though it were a perfectly ordinary day. It was in these small, seemingly insignificant moments that Lisa could pretend she was fine. She could almost convince herself that everything was okay, that life could continue without shaking the foundations of the world she and Robert had built together. The garden was another place Lisa went to find some semblance of peace. Robert had always loved working in the yard. He had a green thumb, something Lisa had never fully appreciated until after he was gone. Now, tending to the roses, the tulips, and the lavender felt like a form of communication with him. Sometimes, when her hands were deep in the soil, she would imagine Robert beside her, his voice murmuring gently, reminding her of the days when they had worked together to plant the seeds for their future. She had often wondered if it had been the plants themselves that gave her the most comfort, or if it was simply the connection to him that made the act of gardening feel so therapeutic. It wasn't until one chilly autumn afternoon, as Lisa was raking the leaves in the yard, that she realized how deeply the weight of grief had shaped her life. She was exhausted, not from the physical work, but from the emotional toll. There was a deep, aching void within her that refused to be filled, no matter how hard she tried to distract herself with various activities. She longed for a change, a sign that it was time to begin moving forward. But the thought of venturing out into the world without Robert by her side was too daunting. What would life look like without him? Who would she be, now that she was no longer defined by her role as his partner? Her thoughts were interrupted when Emily called one afternoon, her voice bright with enthusiasm. "Mom, I think it's time. You need to take a trip. Just for a few days. I've found a little coastal town nearby, nothing too far, just a weekend getaway. You could take your time and relax. You deserve it." Lisa hesitated. A trip? Her mind immediately filled with excuses. Too expensive, too time-consuming, too unfamiliar. But Emily was insistent. "You've been cooped up at home for far too long. Just think about it, okay?" Lisa was quiet for a moment, the weight of her daughter's words sinking in. It wasn't about the trip itself. It was about breaking the pattern of her life, about doing something, anything, to feel alive again. She knew her grief wasn't something that could be solved by a weekend away, but the thought of getting away from the house, from the memories that clung to every room, was a small comfort. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to leave her comfort zone. That evening, after dinner, Lisa sat by the window, staring out at the garden. The sky had darkened, and the stars began to twinkle faintly in the distance. The garden, once a place of shared memories, now felt like an extension of her own grief, a reminder of all that had been lost. Yet, in the stillness of the night, Lisa made a decision. She would take the trip. It wasn't about running away from her grief. It was about learning to live again, in a world that had changed without her consent. She wasn't sure what to expect from the trip, but she knew that in that small act of choosing to step into the unknown, something had shifted within her. It was a tiny spark, but it was enough to push her toward something new. A new chapter, perhaps, one that began with the simple decision to move beyond the life of quiet grief she had been living. Lisa had spent so much of her life being the one who held everything together. She was the strong one, the reliable one. Robert, her late husband, had always been the dreamer, pushing her to do things out of her comfort zone, like taking spontaneous road trips or learning how to cook dishes from different countries. He was the one with the adventurous spirit, while Lisa had always been more cautious, more grounded. She appreciated that about him. He helped her see life in ways she never would have on her own. But now that he was gone, she was left with a sense of emptiness, a void that no amount of tea, books, or long walks in the garden could fill. For the longest time, Lisa had convinced herself that she didn't need anything more. She had her routines, and they gave her a sense of control. The predictability of her daily life, the small comforts like tending to the garden or organizing her home, gave her a measure of peace. But there was an underlying feeling, a constant hum in her thoughts, that told her something was missing. She didn't quite know what it was, but it gnawed at her, like a distant voice calling out from a place she couldn't reach. It wasn't that she was unhappy, at least not in the conventional sense. She was content with the life she had built, yet something deeper, a sense of longing, of yearning for something beyond what she had known, had begun to rise within her. It was only after Emily's insistence on the trip that Lisa realized how much she had been suffocating under the weight of her own grief. Her daughter's suggestion had been simple enough: a weekend getaway, a chance to breathe outside of her home, outside of the daily rituals that felt more like chains than comfort. Lisa had initially brushed it off as impractical, but now the idea started to take root in her mind. The more she thought about it, the more the notion of a brief escape began to excite her, stirring up an old sense of adventure she had long buried under the heaviness of loss. In the quiet of her evenings, after Emily had hung up the phone, Lisa would sit in the stillness of the house, turning the idea over and over in her mind. At first, the thought of going somewhere alone felt foreign. It was something she would have never done in the past. Robert had always been the one to take the lead on travel plans, organizing everything with meticulous attention to detail. Lisa would always go along, not because she was unwilling, but because she trusted him to know what they needed. Without him, the idea of doing something on her own felt daunting. Yet, the more she pondered, the more she realized that it wasn't just a trip she was craving. It was a change, a shift in her life that would push her out of her self-imposed shell. When she went to bed that night, Lisa couldn't help but feel a strange sense of anticipation. She wasn't sure if it was the prospect of a change, the excitement of breaking her routine, or the fear that it would stir up emotions she had buried for so long. But something inside her was stirring, a feeling that something had to shift. As she lay awake in bed, Lisa thought about how much her life had become a routine of grief. She had been so consumed by her loss, so focused on the pain of Robert's death, that she had forgotten what it felt like to live fully. She remembered the early days of their relationship when everything had been an adventure. Their first date had been at a little diner that served the best milkshakes in town. Robert had convinced her to try the strawberry flavor, despite her being a loyal chocolate fan. She had protested at first, but she'd given in. That had been the start of many more adventures, Robert constantly nudging her to try new things, to step outside of the life she had known. But after his death, Lisa had retreated inward, focusing only on the things she could control. She hadn't realized how much of herself she had left behind until now. She longed for the excitement of the unknown. Not the kind that comes from pain or loss, but the kind that comes from living a life without knowing exactly what will come next. The thought of returning to a version of herself that was free, spontaneous, and open to change made her heart race. She missed that person, the woman she used to be before the grief of Robert's passing had consumed her. She missed the Lisa who had laughed without restraint, who had woken up every day with excitement about what the future would bring. But with that longing came an overwhelming fear. What if she failed? What if the adventure, the change, wasn't enough to fill the void? What if it only made the loneliness more palpable, the grief more intense? She had been living in a shell for so long, cocooned by her sorrow, that the idea of stepping into the world again felt like a leap into the unknown. But then she remembered something Robert had once told her: life's too short to live in what-ifs. His words, so simple and yet so profound, echoed in her mind. Lisa realized that, in a way, she had been living in the what-ifs for years. What if Robert had gotten better? What if she had done more to support him? What if their future had been different? It was time to stop living in the past. A few days later, she called Emily and told her she had made a decision. She was going to take the trip. It wasn't about escaping her grief, Lisa realized. It wasn't even about filling the emptiness inside her. It was about giving herself permission to live again, to seek new experiences without the constant shadow of Robert's absence. She was tired of holding herself in place. She was ready to explore what the world had to offer, even if it was a small step at a time. The planning of the trip began slowly, with Lisa browsing through guidebooks, checking out online reviews, and making a list of things to pack. Each small decision felt like a victory: choosing a place to stay, selecting a destination that was far enough to feel different, but close enough that she wouldn't feel completely lost. She hadn't traveled alone in years, but the thought of being in a new place, a place where she didn't have to be anyone's caretaker or partner, brought her a sense of liberation. Despite the excitement, there was also an underlying sense of guilt. Could she really go on a trip without feeling guilty for leaving behind the house, the memories, and the life she had shared with Robert? Was it possible to take a step forward without dishonoring his memory? But Lisa knew deep down that Robert would have encouraged her to go. He had always told her that life wasn't about clinging to the past, but embracing the future, even when it seemed uncertain. He had loved her in a way that made her believe she could face anything, as long as she had his love to guide her. In the days leading up to the trip, Lisa's thoughts swirled between excitement and fear. She packed and repacked her suitcase, each time thinking she had forgotten something important. She wondered how she would feel once she was on her own in a new place, away from the familiarity of home. Would she be able to enjoy the experience, or would the loneliness consume her? And yet, even with these doubts, she felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in a long while, Lisa felt the faintest sense of anticipation. Maybe, just maybe, this trip would be the first step in her journey back to herself. In the final moments before she left, standing at the door of her home with her suitcase in hand, Lisa glanced around one last time. She took a deep breath, as if to reassure herself. She was walking into the unknown, and though it terrified her, it was also exactly what she needed. It wasn't just a trip, it was a beginning. The beginning of rediscovering who she was without Robert, without grief. It was the beginning of her own adventure. And though she didn't know where it would lead, she was ready to find out. The small coastal town was nothing like the world Lisa had known. It seemed like a dream, too perfect to be real, and yet, standing on the cobbled street, breathing in the salty air, she felt the weight of her own uncertainty. The world she had once shared with Robert now seemed like a distant memory, one that existed in a different time and place, too far from this moment to grasp. She had left the comfort of her home behind, the house they had filled with years of laughter and love, and she was here now, in this strange new place, trying to find herself in a world without him. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet town. Lisa was greeted by Clara, the innkeeper, a warm woman with an easy smile. "You must be tired from your journey," Clara said, leading her into the guest house. "Let me show you to your room, and if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. You're here to relax." Lisa nodded, though she wasn't sure if relaxation was possible. She had come here on a whim, choosing the town based on a vague memory of Robert's old stories about his dream of visiting the coast. It had felt like a sign, like the universe had nudged her in this direction, even if she didn't understand why. The guest house was a charming place, with walls of rough-hewn stone, wooden beams across the ceiling, and the faint scent of fresh flowers. It felt old and full of character, the kind of place you could imagine living in for years, taking comfort in its quiet corners. Clara led Lisa up a staircase that creaked underfoot, each step reminding Lisa that she was stepping further away from her old life. The room was simple but inviting, bed linen soft and clean, and a large window with a view of the ocean beyond. As Lisa placed her suitcase down on the bed, she felt a strange mixture of peace and unease. Clara lingered for a moment before excusing herself, leaving Lisa alone in the room. She stood by the window, her eyes scanning the horizon. The ocean stretched out endlessly, its waves whispering secrets that Lisa felt she might never fully understand. "He would have loved this," she said quietly, though the words seemed to hold little weight. Robert had always dreamed of traveling, of seeing places like this, but they never had the chance. Now, Lisa was here alone, trying to keep his memory alive while also learning to live without him. The town was small, almost like a hidden paradise that had been untouched by the hustle of modern life. It had an old-world charm, with narrow streets lined by colorful buildings. People moved slowly, as if they had nowhere else to be, enjoying the peace that came with being by the sea. Lisa felt both out of place and yet strangely at home. It was the first time in months that she wasn't defined by grief, by the constant ache that had followed her since Robert's death. Here, she was just another traveler, another woman looking to find something, even if she wasn't sure what that something was. She spent the afternoon wandering through the town, not really knowing where she was going, but letting the rhythm of the streets guide her. There was a small cafe she stumbled upon, tucked away at the corner of a side street, its windows adorned with colorful flowers. The scent of freshly baked bread wafted out as she pushed open the door, and the warmth inside was a welcome contrast to the cool sea breeze. The cafe was empty except for a few elderly locals, their faces lined with years of life and stories that Lisa could only imagine. She chose a seat by the window, ordering a tea and a pastry, and sat back to watch the world outside. People moved by in a steady, unhurried way, and for the first time in ages, Lisa allowed herself to slow down, to simply observe and take in the quietness of it all. Yet, no matter how still the world seemed, inside, her mind raced. She had left everything behind in search of something she couldn't define but felt she needed desperately. It was as if she had left the life she had built with Robert to try and piece together something new, something that made sense of the emptiness she had felt ever since his passing. The idea of doing it alone terrified her, and yet, here she was, alone, and in an unfamiliar place, taking tentative steps toward the unknown. As she sipped her tea, Lisa realized how difficult it was to be in a place where no one knew her. At home, she was the widow, the woman whose life had been shattered. Everyone knew her story, and there was no escaping it. But here she was a stranger. No one had any expectations of her, no preconceived notions about who she was or what she had lost. The freedom was both liberating and unnerving. The thought of returning home, back to the place where her grief still clung to every corner of the house, felt suffocating. But here, she had the chance to reinvent herself, to step away from the role she had been forced into since Robert's death. She could be anyone she wanted. No one would know the woman who had buried herself in sorrow for so long. As the afternoon faded into evening, Lisa found herself on the beach, the sand soft beneath her feet. The sky had darkened, and the first stars began to appear, twinkling in the vast expanse above her. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was both soothing and melancholic, a reminder of the vastness of the world and her small place in it. She had always loved the ocean. Robert had too. Their dream had been to take a long, carefree trip by the sea, to spend days exploring new places and letting the world wash away their worries. But now, here she was, on a beach she had never seen before, and Robert was not there to share it with her. The pain of that loss hit her like a wave, crashing over her in a way that was both unbearable and necessary. She let the tears come, for they had been building up inside of her since she arrived. It wasn't just the loss of Robert, it was the loss of everything they had planned. She was grieving not just his absence but the life they would never have. As she walked along the shoreline, feeling the cool water lap at her feet, something inside of her began to shift. The grief was still there, deep and unyielding, but there was something else, a quiet stirring, a flicker of hope that she had long buried beneath layers of sadness. It wasn't the hope that things would go back to the way they were, that Robert would return, or that she could somehow undo the past. It was the hope that there could still be more for her in this life. The thought both terrified and thrilled her. She wasn't ready to let go of Robert completely, but perhaps, just perhaps, she was ready to live again. Over the next few days, Lisa immersed herself in the rhythms of this unfamiliar place. She found herself hiking the hills that surrounded the town, taking long walks along the cliffs, breathing in the fresh sea air and finding solace in the quiet beauty of the land. She visited the local markets, spoke to the vendors, and allowed herself to simply exist in this moment, without the weight of her past pressing down on her. But as much as she embraced the newness of it all, there was a nagging voice in the back of her mind, whispering doubts and fears. Was this all just a distraction? Was she running away from the pain that still lived inside her? Could she really leave behind the life she had shared with Robert and build a new one for herself? Despite the uncertainty, Lisa couldn't deny that something had shifted. She was starting to believe that there was more to life than the sorrow she had carried for so long. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in months, she was beginning to open herself up to the possibility that it could hold something good, something worth living for. The unknown was still terrifying, but it was no longer something to run from. It was something to embrace. As she stood at the edge of the cliff one evening, watching the sun sink beneath the horizon, Lisa made a vow to herself. She would no longer let fear hold her back. She didn't know where this journey would take her, but she was ready to find out. As the days turned into weeks, Lisa gradually began to find a rhythm in the coastal town, a slow and steady pace that felt foreign but somehow right. The unfamiliarity of the place, once so overwhelming, began to dissolve, leaving behind a sense of calm she hadn't expected. She still missed Robert deeply, but the crushing weight of grief had lifted just enough to allow her to breathe without feeling as if her chest might cave in at any moment. She didn't understand how or why this was happening, but for the first time since his death, Lisa felt a small, almost imperceptible shift inside her, like a door opening to something new. The town had a way of pulling you in, of making you feel as if time moved differently here, slower and more purposeful. Every morning, she wandered through the narrow streets, the sounds of the town's quiet life greeting her with warmth. The clink of cups in the cafe, the soft laughter of the elderly men who gathered at the market, the low murmur of conversation in the town square, all of it was like a lullaby that seemed to ease the harsh edges of her grief. The mornings were the hardest. The silence of the empty guest house reminded her that she was alone. The once warm embrace of her home now felt suffocating, the empty space around her a constant reminder of Robert's absence. Here, though, the air smelled different, salty, fresh, alive, and it had a way of filling her lungs with a quiet kind of hope. It wasn't that she had forgotten him. She couldn't. The man she had loved, the man who had been her entire world, was gone. But there was something about the ocean, the sweeping vastness of it, that made her feel like maybe there was more to life than loss. She started by taking long walks along the beach each morning, letting the sound of the waves wash over her. She had never realized how much she missed the ocean, the way it seemed to hold the world together with its rhythms, its ceaseless motion. The vastness of the sea gave her room to think, to grieve, but also to let go, if only for a moment. She'd stare out at the horizon and wonder what Robert would have said if he were here. Would he have loved the way the morning sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink? Would he have laughed, pointing out how perfect it was, how alive the world seemed in those first few moments of the day? The town became her refuge. She visited the small bookstore nestled on the corner of a quiet street, where the owner, a tall man with a kind smile named Peter, often greeted her. He had a quiet demeanor, but there was something about him that made her feel at ease. Maybe it was the way he spoke about books with such reverence, as though they held the answers to life's most pressing questions. Or perhaps it was the way he listened when she spoke, never rushing her words, always making her feel like whatever she had to say mattered. At first, Lisa simply browsed the shelves, pulling a few books from the stacks without any particular reason. She didn't expect to find answers in them. Not yet. But each time she came into the store, she left with a new book in hand, a small symbol of progress, a reminder that she was learning to live again, even in the smallest ways. Clara, the innkeeper, also became a silent companion in Lisa's new life. Every evening, Lisa would return to the guest house after her walks, and Clara would be there, ready with a warm smile and a cup of tea. Clara had noticed the changes in Lisa, how she was becoming more and more at ease with her surroundings, how the tightness around her eyes seemed to loosen. "You've been out on the beach again, haven't you?" Clara would say, with a knowing look. Lisa would nod, unable to explain how much the beach had become a part of her healing. It was as if it held answers she couldn't quite grasp but still felt inside her, a kind of peace that had eluded her for so long. Clara never pressed her for details, but she was a woman of few words, her gestures always comforting, as if she understood that sometimes silence could be more healing than any conversation. One evening, after a particularly long walk along the cliffs, Lisa found herself sitting on the rocky edge, gazing at the waves crashing below her. Her body was sore from the hike, but her mind felt clearer, as if she had been away from the world long enough to think again. She pulled out her notebook, which had become a constant companion during her time here, and began to write. She didn't know what she was writing at first. It started as a simple reflection on the day, the way the sun had dipped below the horizon, the way the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of salt and earth, but slowly, her words began to form something else. She began writing about Robert, about their life together, the dreams they had shared, and the places they had hoped to visit. She wrote about the things they never had the chance to do, the adventures that remained untouched by time. She wrote about her grief, but she also wrote about the things she wanted to do now, what she wanted her life to look like moving forward. It wasn't a letter, not exactly. It was a letter to herself, to her future, a message of hope she hadn't realized she still had inside her. The tears came as she wrote, but they weren't the same tears of helplessness that had come when she first arrived. These were tears of release, of letting go, of acceptance. She had started something new, not by force, but by choice. The next day, Clara invited Lisa to visit a small cafe that she and her husband ran on the outskirts of the town. Clara had mentioned it before, but Lisa hadn't been interested. She wasn't quite ready to engage with people outside the quiet sanctuary of the guest house. But now, something was different. Clara had been so kind, and Lisa found herself wanting to know more about the woman who had opened her doors to a stranger. The cafe was just as charming as the guest house, nestled in a quiet corner of the town with flowers spilling over the windowsills. The air was filled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and pastries, and the low hum of conversation added to the atmosphere of warmth and welcome. Clara's husband, a jovial man named George, was quick to strike up a conversation, asking Lisa about her travels, about her stay in the town. As they sat at a table by the window, Lisa realized just how much she had changed. She was talking to strangers, laughing at their jokes, engaging in conversations she would have previously avoided. Her grief still lingered, but it no longer defined her. The woman who sat at that table, sipping her coffee and listening to Clara and George's stories, was not the same woman who had walked into this town a month ago. She had started to let go of the past, little by little, and had started to embrace the possibility of a future. The days turned into weeks, and Lisa's new routine began to feel like a comfortable embrace. Each morning she would rise early and take her walk along the beach, sometimes stopping at the cafe for a warm breakfast, sometimes continuing on toward the cliffs. She started to meet other people in town, locals who had grown accustomed to her presence, who nodded in acknowledgement as she passed. She had become part of the town's fabric, a quiet but essential thread in its tapestry. But it wasn't just the town that had changed her. It was the act of moving forward, of continuing, of adapting. It was the realization that life, no matter how unpredictable or uncertain, could still offer moments of beauty. She had begun to adapt to this new life, not by forgetting the past, but by making space for it alongside everything new. She wasn't running away from her grief. She was learning to live with it, to carry it like a companion, and still move forward. Lisa had come to understand that healing wasn't a straight line, and it didn't happen all at once. But it was happening, slowly but surely. And in the silence of this small coastal town, surrounded by the rhythm of the waves and the comfort of new friendships, she had found a way to begin again. After weeks of tentative exploration, Lisa had finally reached a point where she could no longer deny the quiet longing that had taken root within her. It had started as a whisper, an almost imperceptible desire to embrace life again, to live not just for the memory of Robert but for herself, for her own future. She had tried to ignore it, thinking it was too soon, that she wasn't ready to let go of her grief. But now, with the days stretching ahead of her in the quiet town by the sea, she found herself yearning for something more, something beyond the loneliness that had defined her for so long. Lisa's transformation, as subtle as it had been, had built up to this moment, a decision. She was ready to live again, to truly live, not just exist. It wasn't about replacing Robert or moving on from him. That wasn't possible. But it was about finding joy in the things they had once dreamed of doing together, in honoring the love they had shared by making the most of the life she still had. The moment had come when the weight of her past began to feel more like a burden than a cherished memory. She knew that if she didn't take action now, she might never get the chance to feel truly alive again. She had been inspired by a journal she had found tucked away in one of Robert's old drawers. It wasn't a large journal, nor was it filled with grand adventures or heroic tales. It was simply a collection of small notes, of things they had planned to do, places they had dreamed of visiting, activities they had hoped to experience. It was a kind of roadmap for the future they had always intended to build. But, of course, life had a way of intruding, of throwing roadblocks and detours in their path. The things they had planned never came to fruition. Sitting on her bed, the journal open in front of her, Lisa had read through it several times. There were mentions of their shared dream of visiting Italy, of walking through the winding streets of Rome, standing in awe before the Colosseum and savoring every bite of pasta as they wandered the cobblestone lanes. There were notes about hiking in the Swiss Alps, exploring the quiet towns along the Mediterranean coast, and simply sitting together at sunrise, watching the world come alive. She had always loved the idea of their travels, their shared dreams of adventure, but now the journal felt like a reminder of everything that had been lost. And yet, in that moment, it wasn't sadness that filled her heart, but something else, determination. She would make these dreams real, not just for Robert, but for herself. The moment she closed the journal, Lisa made a promise to herself. She would honor their plans. She would go to Italy, to the Alps, to those places they had talked about. She wouldn't wait anymore. Time was too precious to waste. The decision was made. The next morning, Lisa woke early, feeling a surge of energy that had been absent for months. She made her way to the cafe where Clara worked and asked her about local travel agencies, places that could help her organize a trip to Europe. Clara was taken aback at first. It was clear that Lisa had never expressed such a direct desire before, but she could also see the change in her, the quiet resolve that had taken hold of her. "I know just the place," Clara said, nodding thoughtfully. "There's a small agency over by the pier. They specialize in personalized travel experiences. They'll help you make your dreams come true, just as you've dreamed them." Clara's words felt like an affirmation of Lisa's choice, as if the universe itself was giving her a nudge to go ahead. Within days, Lisa was sitting across from a bright-eyed travel agent named Laura, a woman in her early 30s who had an infectious enthusiasm about all things travel. She listened attentively as Lisa outlined her desires. Italy, the Swiss Alps, a journey through small towns along the coast. Laura smiled as she took notes, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "You're going to love it," Laura said after a few minutes of discussion. "Italy is magic. And the Alps? I mean, there's nothing like standing on top of the world, looking down at the valleys below. I can help you put together an itinerary, something that honors both your dreams and the things Robert wanted to do with you." It was as if she had opened a door that had been closed for so long. Every detail they discussed filled Lisa with a sense of anticipation. She could see it now, the cobblestone streets of Rome, the towering peaks of the Alps, the feeling of the sun on her face as she wandered through tiny villages in the Italian countryside. As Laura began sketching out the itinerary, Lisa felt a sense of excitement stir inside her, a deep, almost childlike giddiness. It was something she hadn't felt in years. She had forgotten what it was like to dream this way, to plan for something that would bring joy instead of pain. Robert had wanted these things for them, and now she was finally going to live them. Weeks passed in a blur of preparations. Lisa pored over travel books, studied maps, and made plans to visit all the places she and Robert had dreamed of. She spent hours imagining herself standing in the middle of the ancient Roman Forum, walking the streets of Venice, feeling the weight of history beneath her feet. It was all so surreal. In many ways, it felt as though she was simply fulfilling a dream that was always meant to be hers. But the closer the trip came, the more she began to feel conflicted. She had told herself this was something she needed to do, that it would be a way to move forward, to reclaim the joy she had lost. But deep inside, there was a nagging voice. Was this really the right thing? Was traveling alone to all these places they had once dreamed of together the answer? Would it help her heal, or would it leave her feeling emptier than ever? The night before her departure, Lisa sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the packed suitcase. It was filled with clothes, toiletries, and her camera, a gift from Robert that she hadn't used in years. The sight of the camera brought a fresh wave of grief, but this time, it wasn't the suffocating, overwhelming grief that had consumed her for so long. It was a quieter, more subtle ache, one that reminded her of all the things she had lost, and all the things she had yet to experience. But she knew now that she couldn't hold on to the past forever. She couldn't keep waiting for something that might never come. Robert wouldn't want that for her. The love they shared had been beautiful, but life had moved on. And so, with one last glance at the suitcase, Lisa took a deep breath, grabbed the camera, and slipped it into her bag. The next morning, as the plane soared into the sky, Lisa looked out of the window, watching the world shrink beneath her. Her heart fluttered with a mixture of excitement and fear. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she knew one thing for sure. She was finally taking the first step into a life she had once believed was lost. The weeks that followed were nothing short of transformative. Italy was every bit as beautiful as she had imagined, with its rich history, its grand architecture, and its charming streets that felt like stepping into another world. Lisa wandered through the narrow alleys of Rome, stood in awe at the Colosseum, and marveled at the beauty of the Sistine Chapel. She sat in cafes, sipping espresso, and watching the world go by, feeling a sense of peace she had not known in years. But the true magic happened in the quiet moments. The mornings when she watched the sun rise over the Tuscan hills, the evenings when she wandered through quiet streets in small villages, lost in thought. In those moments, Lisa felt Robert with her, not as a ghost, but as a part of her, alive in her memories, in the very air she breathed. Every corner of the world she visited was a tribute to the dreams they had shared. And in living those dreams, Lisa realized that she had found something even more precious than the adventures themselves, the realization that she was still capable of joy, that the future held endless possibilities. Her journey wasn't just about fulfilling Robert's wishes, it was about fulfilling her own. And in doing so, she had finally learned the most important lesson of all, that life, even in its most painful moments, still holds the potential for beauty, for adventure, for love, and that it was never too late to start anew. Lisa had never imagined that the act of fulfilling a dream would be so painful. Her journey through Italy and the Swiss Alps had been everything she'd hoped for, and more, a rediscovery of joy, a rekindling of the fire that had once burned so brightly between her and Robert. Yet, the further she traveled into the life she had always dreamed of, the more she began to realize that something was missing. It wasn't a physical absence, but something far deeper, an emotional void that seemed to grow the more she embraced her new reality. Her travels, while beautiful and transformative, began to feel like an escape. They offered fleeting moments of happiness, but they didn't provide the lasting peace she had hoped for. Every stunning vista, every new experience, was tinged with a quiet sorrow, the longing for Robert's presence, for the shared memories that now seemed just out of reach. At night, when Lisa lay alone in her hotel room, she would often find herself staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, consumed by an overwhelming sense of loneliness. She had come to Europe with the intention of finding herself again, of rekindling the sense of adventure that had once fueled her, but she hadn't anticipated the emptiness that would follow her from place to place. The more she immersed herself in the life she was trying to create, the more she began to question her motivations. Was this journey truly about healing, or was she simply running away from the pain she had buried for so long? She had convinced herself that by honoring Robert's dreams, she could heal the wounds of her past, but now she wasn't so sure. Each day spent traveling in his memory seemed to bring her further from the peace she sought, rather than closer to it. The price she had paid for this journey was not financial, it was emotional. She had traded her quiet, familiar life for the thrill of adventure, but the cost was a deeper isolation. Lisa found herself caught between two worlds, the life she had known, which no longer seemed to fit, and the life she was trying to create, which only seemed to deepen her sense of loss. The memories of Robert were never far from her mind, and every corner of Italy, every mountain in Switzerland, seemed to hold a piece of him. They were the places he had dreamed of visiting, the life they had planned to live together. But now that she was there without him, everything felt incomplete. There were moments when she would stop in a quiet street, or stand at the edge of a cliff, and imagine him beside her, imagining what it would have been like if they had lived out their dreams as they had intended. The love she felt for him, the deep connection that had bound them together, was ever present, but it was also a source of pain. Her desire to live out the dreams they had shared was noble, but it also meant confronting the reality of her situation. She was alone, and no amount of traveling or new experiences could change that. Lisa realized that she had been trying to fill a hole that couldn't be filled, that she had been searching for something outside herself to heal an internal wound. The truth was, no matter how far she traveled, no matter how many beautiful places she visited, she would never be able to escape the reality of Robert's absence. She would never be able to replace the love they had shared. One evening, after a long day of hiking through the Swiss Alps, Lisa returned to her cabin and sat down by the window, gazing out at the mountains that stretched as far as the eye could see. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the landscape, but it only served to deepen her sense of longing. She had visited some of the most beautiful places on earth, yet she felt no closer to finding peace. Her heart still ached with the absence of the one person who had once made her world feel complete. In that moment, she realized the depth of the sacrifice she had made. She had traded comfort, familiarity, and the life she had known for something that was ultimately unattainable. She had sought healing in external experiences, but true healing, she now understood, could not be found in a plane ticket or a new destination. The weight of this realization was crushing. Lisa had spent so many months convinced that the answer to her pain was in moving forward, in stepping out into the world and living the life she and Robert had dreamed of. But now she saw the flaw in her thinking. She had been trying to outrun her grief, to numb the pain with distraction. The truth was, grief could not be outrun. It would always find a way to catch up with her, no matter how far she traveled or how many new experiences she sought. It was a heavy, sobering truth. And with it came a profound sense of loss, not just for Robert, but for the person she had been before his death. Lisa realized that, in her attempt to live a life filled with excitement and new experiences, she had lost sight of the quiet, everyday moments that had once brought her peace. She had been so focused on living out Robert's dreams that she had neglected her own, dreams that weren't tied to travel or grand adventures, but to simpler, more intimate experiences. She had lost the ability to find joy in the small things: a morning coffee, a quiet walk through the park, the company of friends and family. The heavy price of her journey was not just the emotional toll it had taken on her, but the loss of the life she had left behind. In her pursuit of something grander, she had forgotten the value of the ordinary. She had been so focused on recreating a future that wasn't meant to be that she had forgotten to live in the present. She had tried to outrun her grief by seeking out new experiences, but in doing so, she had lost sight of the life she could still have, here and now. Lisa's struggle reached its peak on the final day of her trip. After weeks of wandering through cities and villages, seeing beautiful landscapes and meeting new people, she stood at the edge of a cliff in the Swiss Alps, looking out at the vast, snow-covered mountains. It was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when she would finally feel at peace, when all the grief and sorrow would melt away, and she would be free to live the life she had always dreamed of. But instead of feeling the exhilaration she had expected, Lisa felt only emptiness. She had reached the end of her journey, but the sense of fulfillment she had hoped for was nowhere to be found. It was then that she understood. The journey had not been about the places she had visited or the experiences she had collected. It had been about something far deeper, coming to terms with the fact that life was unpredictable, that love, even the most profound love, could be fleeting, and that healing required facing the pain head-on, not running from it. She had spent so much time looking for external validation, for a sense of closure, but now she realized that closure could only come from within. As Lisa stood on that cliff, the cold wind whipping around her, she felt the weight of her journey, not as a burden, but as a stepping stone. She had paid the price for her attempt to outrun her grief. But in doing so, she had learned something vital, that the road to healing was not found in far-off places or exciting new experiences, but in the quiet acceptance of her loss and the courage to begin again, even when the path seemed uncertain. She was no longer the woman who had boarded a plane in search of a dream. She was someone else, someone who had come to understand that living meant facing the pain, the emptiness, and the loss head-on, and still finding a way to move forward, even if that meant stepping back into her own life, not as a version of the past, but as a woman ready to embrace what was left of her future. Lisa had come to the end of her journey, or so it seemed. Standing at the edge of the cliff in the Swiss Alps, She had felt the harsh winds of realization cutting through her, stripping away the illusions that had once fueled her desire to escape. The truth was undeniable now. She could not outrun the grief of losing Robert, nor could she recreate the life they had dreamed of together. It was time to go home. The flight back was quiet, the hum of the airplane a constant reminder of her return to the life she had left behind. As the plane descended toward the familiar skyline of her city, Lisa felt an odd sense of both relief and apprehension. She had spent so much time seeking solace in distant lands, in the shadow of distant mountains, and in the ephemeral beauty of places that had once felt like a dream come true. But now, in the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by the soft murmur of fellow passengers, she understood that the true answer lay not in the places she had visited, but in the life she had left behind. When she finally stepped off the plane and into the airport terminal, the overwhelming noise and bustle of the crowd seemed jarring. The bright lights, the hurried footsteps, the announcements over the loudspeakers, it was a world that felt both foreign and deeply familiar. It felt as if she had been away for much longer than a few weeks, as though she had been absent for years, but at the same time, everything was exactly as she had left it. The same faces, the same sights. Nothing had changed. Or perhaps it was she who had changed, now that she had seen the world from a new perspective. The car ride back to her home felt different too. The streets, once so ordinary, now seemed to hold a kind of quiet beauty that she had never appreciated before. The rows of houses, the park with its familiar swings, the grocery store she had always walked past without a second thought, all of it suddenly felt more vivid, more significant. It was as though she was seeing everything for the first time, not with the eyes of a woman who had tried to escape her grief, but with the eyes of someone who had begun to understand that life, in all its simplicity, was still worth living. As she pulled into her driveway and saw the house that had been her home for years, Lisa felt a pang of nostalgia. She had left this place in search of answers, and now, she was returning not as the woman who had left, but as someone transformed by the journey she had taken, by the lessons she had learned, and by the peace she had found within herself. Entering the house was like stepping back into the past, and yet it was a new beginning. The familiar scent of the room, the soft creak of the floorboards, the warmth of the kitchen, everything felt comforting, but there was also a quiet sadness that lingered in the corners. Robert's absence was still present, like a shadow that couldn't be chased away, but Lisa no longer felt the overwhelming weight of it. She had come to terms with the reality of his death, not by trying to outrun the pain, but by embracing it as part of her journey. The first night back in her own bed was difficult. The silence seemed louder than ever, and the emptiness beside her was a reminder that she would never share these moments with Robert again. But even in that silence, there was a sense of peace. It was not the peace of escape, the fleeting calm that had come from running away, but the peace of acceptance, the kind that comes from understanding that life, no matter how short, is still worth living. The next few days were a blur of small tasks, unpacking her suitcase, sorting through the souvenirs she had collected, and settling back into the routine she had left behind. But something had shifted. She was no longer the woman who had fled from her grief, the woman who had thought that traveling and seeking new experiences could fill the void left by Robert's absence. She was now a woman who had learned that true healing did not come from the outside, but from within. Lisa had spent so much of her life waiting for something external to fix her, to fill the emptiness she had felt since Robert's death. But the truth she had learned on her journey was this: healing wasn't about finding new experiences or new places. It was about allowing herself to feel the pain, to mourn, and to slowly build a new life from the pieces that remained. She had come to understand that life was never meant to be about avoiding pain, but about learning how to live with it, to accept it as part of the human experience. It was a difficult lesson, one that she had resisted for so long, but it was also the most liberating one. Lisa no longer needed to run. She no longer needed to search for meaning in distant lands or to recreate the past she had lost. Instead, she began to focus on what was right in front of her, the small, ordinary moments that had once seemed so insignificant. She took long walks through her neighborhood, enjoying the rhythm of her steps, the warmth of the sun on her face, the sound of birds singing in the trees. She made a habit of sitting in her favorite chair with a cup of tea, reading a book, or simply staring out the window, savoring the stillness of the moment. It was in these moments that Lisa began to rediscover a kind of joy that had nothing to do with grand adventures or exotic destinations. It was the joy of being present, of finding beauty in the everyday. She had been so focused on seeking something outside of herself to heal her, but now she understood that the healing she had been looking for was already within her. It had always been there, buried beneath the layers of grief and pain, waiting to be uncovered. One of the first things Lisa did after returning home was to visit Robert's grave. She hadn't been to see him in months, not since she had left for her journey. Standing in front of his tombstone, she felt a wave of emotion wash over her, grief, love, loss, and acceptance all intertwined. She realized that, while she would never stop missing him, she could still honor his memory in a way that was meaningful. She didn't need to keep running to find closure or to feel connected to him. She could carry him with her in her heart, in the memories they had shared, and in the lessons he had taught her. Lisa began to reconnect with old friends, those she had pushed away in the months following Robert's death. She called her mother more often, sharing moments of her life with the people who had always been there for her. It wasn't that she had forgotten the importance of these relationships, but that she had been so consumed by her grief and her need to escape that she had neglected them. Now, she was ready to embrace them again, to rebuild the connections that had once sustained her. In the weeks that followed, Lisa slowly began to re-enter the world she had left behind. She resumed her job, though with a new perspective. She found that the work she had once found tedious now felt meaningful. She rediscovered the joy of teaching, the satisfaction of helping others learn and grow. She also began to take better care of herself, realizing that self-care was not about running away, but about creating a life where she could thrive in the face of loss. Lisa had returned home, but she was no longer the same person who had left. She had returned not as someone seeking an escape from grief, but as someone who had learned to live with it. She had learned that true healing didn't come from fleeing the pain, but from embracing it and allowing it to become a part of her story, rather than a force that defined her. The journey had been long, and it had come at a cost, but in the end, Lisa had found what she needed. Not a new life, but a new way of living the one she already had. The woman who had once believed that happiness lay in distant places and far-off adventures had returned to her own life, armed with the understanding that peace could be found right where she was. She had learned that love, though it may fade in the physical world, could never truly be lost, and that every day was an opportunity to find meaning, even in the smallest of moments. She had come back not just with memories of distant lands, but with the deep knowledge that her life, her own life, was enough.